Hello, all. I'm Stephanie Bergeron, Perdue, and with me today is Chairman Jon Niermann of the TCEQ and Regional Administrator Ken McQueen. Thank you guys for being here today. It's good to see you guys virtually. We're going to start today's panel discussion concerning the pandemic, environmental compliance, and EPA rulemaking with some brief remarks from the three of us. My remarks are just to comment on the timing of my departure from TCEQ was right at the beginnings of the pandemic. And I would like to say how impressed I was by the agency and its ability to pivot from a traditional work environment to essentially a teleworking one within 2 weeks. And has continued to be able to do its work through the duration of the pandemic. And with that, I will turn it over to Administrator McQueen.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good day to all my friends out there in Texas. It's great to be with you and Chairman Niermann today. I was on a conference call yesterday with our tribal partners, and one of them mentioned that this was the first time in U.S. history that every state in the union was under a state of emergency. And I was struck about how that really characterized the breadth and depth of this pandemic. Like much of the rest of the world, EPA Region 6 has been continuing to respond to the challenges brought about by COVID-19. And that response continues to evolve as we move forward each day. The paramount importance to us is the safety of our workforce, and we've been teleworking since the end of March under our continuity of operations plan, or what we call in EPA speak is COOP mode. EPA's been, I think, more fortunate than many agencies in that we've had limited telework for our employees in the past. So when we went to full-time telework, we already had a lot of capability in place, including, in fact, most of our employees work from laptops. We have been upgrading some of our older laptops for camera capability. One of our biggest challenges was having enough VPN when we started, but that's been addressed. I found personally that my biggest challenges have actually been with the internet, Wi-Fi, and cell phone service, which I continue to find a mystery because I live in the middle of town and I have fiber to my house. But we've been continuing to be able to respond to the agency's objectives and workloads, and I think our metrics are showing that we're keeping on track of where we should be with moving the agency's work down the road.
Thank you, Ken. Chairman Niermann, would you like to make a few remarks?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, and good to see you, Ken. And I can't see anybody in the audience, which is odd, but it's good to be with you virtually today. The onset of the pandemic in March was a moment of real uncertainty for the agency, for all of us. This virus is highly contagious. We know it to be deadly. None of us have seen anything like it. And at TCEQ, we needed to figure out how to protect each other, but also how to continue our mission to protect public health and the environment. And in terms of protecting each other, I think our response was pretty typical of other work environments. We shifted to working remotely, as Stephanie mentioned. I think that's something that we did well. We implemented new electronic work processes. We took other measures to mitigate the risk of transmission. And at the same time, the regulated community was asking us how they should address regulations that put their employees at risk of contracting and spreading the disease. And we're going to get into the specifics of that in a minute. But for purposes of my opening remarks, I want to emphasize that TCEQ's first priority was and continues to be slowing transmission of COVID-19. And just as a reference point, we're recording this on July 23rd. The pandemic has claimed the lives of more than 4,000 Texans, more than 140,000 lives nationally. And more than the deaths, it's also been really debilitating for a lot of people. We have an obligation for the well-being of our employees, for their safety, as well as for their families and their communities, and for the well-being of the employees of the entities that we regulate. But even more than that, if our staff is ill, they can't do their jobs. They can't analyze drinking water samples. They can't conduct investigations. They can't provide compliance assistance. And for the regulated entities, the loss of an experienced operator, even temporarily, can amplify the risk to our critical infrastructure. So all of that informs the agency's approach to the pandemic and provides some context for our conversation today.
That was a very nice segue, Chairman Niermann. The first part of our panel discussion today is going to focus on how the respective state and federal agencies have dealt with regulated entities and compliance in this context of a pandemic. I'm going to very briefly reference to some headlines that came about on kind of the outset of the pandemic, and then more recently. And then I'm going to lead into a couple of questions for you guys. So the first one that captured my attention was, quote, TCEQ loosens enforcement amid COVID-19. Here's one that I'm paraphrasing from an article. Polluters respond to absence of regulatory enforcement by potentially increasing their pollution on average. And then my last sample here is from a headline, quote, companies encouraged with Texas environmental rules during coronavirus may not have to, state says. So let's go ahead and start discussing the respective approaches by EPA and TCEQ. More specifically, can you each address how your respective agencies are handling compliance during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic? And Chairman Niermann, why don't we go ahead and start with you and then switch over to Regional Administrator McQueen.
Sure, and I'll get to your question in a minute, but let me begin with the notion that's reflected in these news articles that there's an absence of enforcement or an increase in pollution. As of the end of May, which is the most recent data that we have on our enforcement activity, staff in TCEQ's Office of Compliance and Enforcement is on pace to outperform both 2018 and 2019 in the number of enforcement action referrals, the number of effective enforcement orders that have been issued, in total penalties assessed, and in total supplemental environmental projects. And staff is also outperforming 2018 and only slightly underperforming 2019 for the number of notices of violations that have been issued. And that information is from our regular monthly reports, which are publicly available on our website. So not only is our enforcement activity ongoing, but it's very much present, it's also comparing well to previous years. And as for increased pollution, we're looking for it, but we're not finding it. The ozone data is mixed, and we're studying that. Our preliminary understanding is that ozone levels are within normal historic ranges. As for VOCs, volatile organic compounds, we've looked at air quality data from monitors, and we specifically selected monitors that were close to regulated entities that have requested and were granted enforcement discretion for certain VOC levels. And these are monitors in the Houston Ship Channel and also in Corpus Christi's refinery row. And we looked at ethane and propylene, ethylene, and benzene, and we are not finding increases correlated with the pandemic. And that information is presented in a series of graphs that are posted to TCEQ's COVID-19 webpage. And so they're there for anybody to reference. So the idea that there's an absence of enforcement or an increase in pollution as a result of the pandemic simply is not supported in any of the data that we're seeing. So back to your question, how are we handling non-compliance in this era of the pandemic? We're doing it the same way that we did before the pandemic. What TCEQ has done differently is simply to create some additional process around how we exercise our enforcement discretion. And specifically on March 18th, TCEQ issued a statement that it would consider pandemic-related requests for enforcement discretion that are submitted by email and contain certain information, and that includes the justification for the request. And our Office of Compliance and Enforcement staff review these requests on a case-by-case basis, and they make a case-by-case determination on them.
Ken, would you like to go ahead and address it from EPA's perspective?
Sure. Despite the challenges imposed by COVID-19, EPA's enforcement program has continued to be very active. We've opened a number of criminal complaints during this COVID-19 pandemic. We've increased our FIFRA enforcement work. FIFRA, by the way, is one of those EPA terms for Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And we're using that against the sale of products that falsely claim to be effective against the coronavirus. And this includes issuing stop sale and cease and desist orders and warning letters. We've been working closely with the Customs and Border Patrol to prevent the importation of more than 10,000 illegal products. EPA's Region 6 pesticide imports team have issued notice of refusal of admission on arrival, or what we call NORA's memos, to the Customs and Border for unregistered pesticide products and devices. The NORA prevents the entry of these products into the United States, and depending on the situation, the importer may be able to bring the product into compliance, or the product will be destroyed by the CBP. We've also continued strong enforcement across the board. Between March 16th through June 5th, EPA has opened 78 criminal enforcement cases. We've charged 24 defendants. We 235 civil enforcement actions, and we've initiated 215 civil enforcement actions. And although we've been active, EPA has also taken common sense steps to balance needed flexibility for the regulated community during this pandemic with EPA's obligation for compliance with the nation's environmental laws. So we issued a temporary enforcement policy, or a TEP, on March 26, which was developed with career staff, regional office, and the states as well. And this had a threefold purpose. The first was to avoid a deluge of requests for flexibility about routine monitoring and reporting requirements in order to focus on emergency situations and situations that involve acute risk or imminent harm. Second, to balance needed flexibility for the regulated community during the COVID-19 pandemic with our obligation to ensure compliance. And third, to provide transparency about what we expect and how we can expect to consider noncompliance due to COVID. This policy applies to civil violations during the COVID-19 outbreak. For example, EPA does not expect to seek penalties for noncompliance with routine monitoring and reporting obligations that are the result of COVID-19 pandemic. But we do expect operators of public water systems to continue to ensure the safety of our drinking water supplies. Since March 26, Region 6 has received 13 notice of potential force majeure events, 6 compliance extension requests, 4 enforcement discretion requests, and 4 notices to which headquarters is drafting responses. We've sent stop sale orders to both Amazon and EPA to stop selling certain pesticides that were not registered. Since March 20th, the region has issued 19 NORAs to Customs and Border Protection ports within the region, blocking the entry of 233,000 pounds of unregistered and illegal pesticides, products, and devices. And this includes 127,000 pounds of pesticide that were specifically making claims for effectiveness against the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, an additional 70,000 pounds that could have been interpreted to be effective against the virus that causes COVID-19.
Thank you both. I think, Ken, I feel like you touched on how EPA has applied these regulatory enforcement mechanisms. And I think similarly to TCEQ, John, I don't know if you wanted to have an opportunity to speak briefly, maybe just give an example of how the agency has utilized its discretion vis-a-vis, like, for example, reporting requirements.
Sure. So in a typical case, you would see a refinery that would meet a certain LDAR, leak detection and repair requirement, but not be able to do it within the regulatory deadline. And so in an email to the Office of Compliance and Enforcement, the refinery would explain that they're unable to meet the deadline due to staff scheduling issues typically related to the pandemic. And then we would send an email back telling them, after reviewing that on a individual case-by-case basis, if their justification held, we notified them that we would exercise our discretion not to pursue enforcement for missing that deadline. Or if the justification wasn't sufficient, we'd deny the request. And we've denied somewhere between 10 and 15% of the now nearly 200 requests that we've received. I'd also want to point out, though, that we posted details about every request we've received to TCEQ's COVID-19 website. And we have an Excel spreadsheet posted there. All of the requests are listed on the spreadsheet. In some cases, most of the cases, there are links to the actual email requests and responses. That document is updated weekly. Some of the information has been withheld as required under the Public Information Act. But if we can post it, we will post it. And I also want to point out, too, that puts Texas among the most transparent environmental regulatory agencies in the nation in terms of how we're handling enforcement during the pandemic. So TCEQ is an outlier in that respect.
And for both of you guys, I think this is a fairly short answer, but how long do you anticipate these enforcement approaches to remain in place? Ken, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Our temporary enforcement policy is set to expire of August 31.
And Chairman Niermann?
Yeah, so our enforcement discretion is part of our inherent authority, so we're going to have that. But in terms of the process that we've created for the pandemic, I think the virus is going to dictate the timeline. And I think it's going to be an organic process. So as the regulated community learns to adapt, it won't need to request enforcement discretion as much. And I think we're already seeing that. We're about 20 weeks into this pandemic. Half of the requests we received came within the first 5 weeks. And so there's been a tapering off, and I'm anticipating that we'll continue to see that until there's no longer a need for it.
Okay. And I'm trying to be mindful of our time. We have a relatively short panel with more to cover. So I'm going to go on to the question that related to exercise of the regulatory exercise of enforcement discretion. Does that mean a regulated entity is exempted from compliance? And Regional Administrator McQueen, I thought I'd let you have a shot at that first.
Well, the short answer is that's an emphatic no. There is no moratorium on enforcement, and there is no license to pollute. EPA is still enforcing the law, and any suggestion to the contrary is not only accurate, but it's a disservice to the regulated community. The enforcement policy, or TEP, does not change the statutory regulatory obligations, nor does it change obligations under consent decrees or administrative settlements. It specifically addresses situations that might create an acute risk or an imminent risk of harm to the public or the environment, as well as protecting safe drinking water and making sure the hazardous waste is handled correctly. This TEP does the following. It requires facilities to return to compliance as soon as possible. It explains how the regulated community can expect EPA to exercise its enforcement discretion with respect to non-compliance with routine monitoring and reporting requirements that are actually caused by COVID-19. It explains the regulated community needs to notify EPA immediately if COVID-19 is causing non-compliance that may result in an acute risk or a risk of imminent harm to public safety or the environment. It allows electronic signatures instead of the original wet signatures where necessary, and it requires notification of failures of air emission controls and wastewater treatment systems. Let me talk about what the TEP is not. It's not a moratorium on enforcement. It does not allow exceedances of pollutant limitations in permits, regulations, and statutes. It does not affect the terms and conditions of consent decrees or administrative settlements. It does not apply to criminal violations. And to be sure, we are requiring affirmative notification where there may be acute risks or imminent harm. Companies are expected to comply, and noting that the TEP changes monitoring or reporting requirements. Chairman Niermann?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Similar answer, and I can appreciate how members of the general public might not fully appreciate the difference, that this may be splitting hairs, whether you're talking about an exemption or exercising enforcement discretion. For regulators and the regulated community, there's a big difference. An exemption means that a statute or rule is simply not going to be applied. Enforcement discretion acknowledges that not only is there a statute and a rule that applies, but there has been or will be a violation. But then it is an exercise of case-by-case discretion that looks at whether it's appropriate under these particular circumstances to pursue an enforcement action based on that violation. And I think, one of the key distinctions is there are eyeballs on this violation, and we're making a determination based on our best judgment as an agency about what the appropriate course of action is. And if compliance would be at odds with our goal to interrupt transmission of the virus or put our communities at risk, we're not going to demand compliance.
We're at the point now in the panel discussion where I'm advised to inform the audience that the CLE code word for this presentation is 862 EPA, and that you guys are to please record this on your CLE form. Unfortunately, we've bumped up against our time limit, so I'm going to go ahead and ask the panelists to give some concluding remarks. Ken, would you like to go ahead first?
Thanks, Stephanie. It's been a pleasure to join you all today. As you've heard us discuss, we're facing some unprecedented challenges in the nation today. But as I see the work done along with our partners like Chairman Niermann at TCEQ, I'm encouraged that we can come through these uncertain times stronger than before. This is the 50th year for EPA. We celebrate our 50th anniversary on December 2nd. And over those past 50 years, EPA has spearheaded some of our greatest environmental achievements from our founding principles. All of our environmental indicators in the different media have improved significantly since 1970. Here's a couple of examples. In 1970, more than 40% of our nation's drinking water systems failed to meet even the most basic health standards. Today, over 92% of community water systems now meet all health-based standards all the time. And America continues to be a leader in clean air progress, reducing the 6 criteria air pollutants by 73% over the past 50 years. In the past 3 years alone, we've moved 38 states from non-attainment to attainment. I hope to continue working together with Chairman Niermann and the TCEQ, as well as our other state partners, as we protect the environment and our public health. Thanks.
Chairman
Thank you,
Niermann?
Ken. It's been great to be with you today. And I know we're out of time, so I'm going to make 3 quick points. If you want to know anything about TCEQ's response to the pandemic, it's probably already posted on TCEQ's COVID-19 website. If you need anything from the agency, let us know. We're hard at work. We're here to assist you. And finally, please take care of yourselves and your families. Maintain social distancing, wash your hands, wear your face mask, be strong, and we are going to get through this. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.